There's no response as in other situations where we react to what isn't present. This lack is a lack of knowledge. Disease is what we don't know. So for us as humans, it's to find out. So the lack is lessened, if that makes any sense. That eventually, the more knowledge man and woman can create in the world, disease is diminished. So it's our duty as partners with God to bring the lack of knowledge to a lower level, to increase knowledge, and to therefore decrease disease at the same time.
Jake, I don't know if you want to tackle or I'll move on to link up the physical health and spiritual health. Does your faith tradition suggest a link between what we've already heard, and I assume, Jake, you're going to assume that we get sick because doctors say we do. Is there a link between our spiritual health and the physical health? And if so, how does it function?
Yeah, that's where I would have gone with the last question. Is I think in pre-modern Christianity, yeah, you can find all sorts of interesting solutions to sickness and reasons for it. But ever with the development of modern medicine, I think most of us have a pretty decent understanding of where illness comes from. On the other hand, if you're using illness to talk about spiritual illness or sickness or things like that, that's where the faith tradition might be more important. In the Catholic tradition, at least, we typically tend to follow a more natural law orientation derived from Thomas Aquinas and others that would say God is the first cause of all things, but there are also secondary causes, and those are the things that we talked about, like what our physician here just noted. Those would all be considered secondary causes. The reason you get sick is because you catch a virus, et cetera, right? So God is the ultimate cause behind it, but that is in no way incompatible with the idea that there are still material causes on earth that are creating illnesses. So Catholicism has attempted to hold together this view of divine causality and material physical causality. It's not incompatible, but just different sides of the same coin. And I think similar things could be said along the lines of spirituality, the need for full body health. I mean, I know currently discussion of mental health is going more to talk about the brain as a physical part of the body and how mental health is not some sort of the mind is not removed from the body, but is also connected to the organ of the brain, and therefore, mental health is also a physical ailment. So when we think about spiritual health and the interconnectedness of all this, I think there are ways in which people have different levels of mental, physical, and spiritual health and well-being that all interact with each other. So it's important to pay attention to all those things.
Anyone else want to speak about the link between spiritual health and physical health?
Generally, we go back to what I was saying earlier, that we are responsible for ourselves as humans, along with our spiritual connection to God. So when we are sick, we need to examine ourselves first. What could have brought us to this sickness? What ideas, what attitudes? And also, the disease itself, we look at as something to overcome through human means, as I was saying, through science, if it be that method. Spirituality is connected to science. And we look to science to help us solve some of those issues. But first we get advice from the Jewish perspective, you go to the doctor first, and then you start praying. So this way, you're covering all your bases.
I just have a question.
I asked the questions here. No, I'm kidding.
I understand when I have fever, I have a rash. I understand I have pain. People, meningitis has been around for a long time. People knew if there is stiffness in the neck, pain, fever, that in the next 5 to 7 days, this person can die. Plague. There were clear symptoms, signs combined together. I'm giving you examples of physical diseases. You ask spiritual diseases or spiritual health, assuming that all of us understand what is spiritual health. I don't. Could you please give me some examples? Like just I gave you examples of physical diseases. Can you give me some examples of spiritual diseases and spiritual health?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Unfortunately, I had a mic in my hand, so I couldn't put the quotes up around spiritual health because I actually wanted you to define it. So I think it's an excellent question of how you would respond what is physical health. Each one of them.
I think spiritual health comes from within us as well as from God. It starts, again, with your own responsibility, right thinking, and sort of Buddhist in a way, proper thinking, proper behavior, proper action, all of which add to our spiritual well-being. If we are physically well, it is easier to pray to God. It is easier to function as a human in the world. Spiritual well-being comes from many factors that are complex, really, in our bodies and externally as well. I suppose right thinking and right behavior are the most important.
Jake, would you want to respond to that?
So, in my understanding, and I'm speaking as a Catholic and as a distinct kind of Catholic here, I'm not a big fan of most dualist theologies, and so I tend towards associating spiritual health, mental health, and physical health all quite closely. But if I were to separate those out and distinguish what I meant by each one, I think I would say fundamentally, spiritual illness or spiritual sickness that I'd be concerned with is fundamentally an imbalance of relationships in some meaningful way. It's not just an emotional experience of feeling like I'm really fired up for Jesus right now, or I feel disconnected right now. I think it's a deeper sense of the commitments and relationships that are important to who I am and who I ought to be are somehow imbalanced, and I'm having difficulty setting them in order. So I think it parallels in some ways other relational challenges, but that's how I would define spiritual well-being.
I think you raise an interesting issue, and that is, as we're speaking out of your faith tradition, what does God actually do? I mean, Jim, you mentioned prayer. Does healing come from God at all? Or is it just human hands? Does prayer help? Is there other things? And is there stories in your tradition about healing that help us to understand that? I'd like all three of you at some point to address those questions. Or not.
I just had one group of answers. You have your own answers too. We share those. We can share those answers. Prayer is efficacious. It's practical. It's calming, soothing. It brings us closer to an equilibrium that we're talking about earlier. Finding equilibrium, which can help improve our health, obviously. The sense of equilibrium. I don't know if I'm answering the question right.
No, I think that's working. I'm just trying to, doesn't your faith tradition, God, do anything? Or is it all the medical?
No, prayer directed toward God and intention with it can help, I believe, in the healing process. And maybe that's God, or maybe that's internal within us.
Like I just said, I have a hard time contrasting the action of God with human action. So, in a sense, yeah, God does lots. He gave us the knowledge to understand disease. He gave us people with special abilities to treat diseases. He's given us, the opportunity to learn more and discover these things. So, at the level of primary causation, yeah, God has given us all the tools that we need to continue with medical advancements, and that's a really great gift. I'd echo what was said about prayer. Prayer is the opportunity to be in relationship and be in conversation with God, and it's really important to have those relationships in balance for one's well-being. And so I do think prayer and meditation and other forms of spiritual reflection are important for physical well-being. The Christian tradition itself is chock full of miracle stories and healing stories and miraculous events. I'm personally not one to put a lot of stock in that, so if that is your form of Christianity, unfortunately you're going to be disappointed with my answers here. In my understanding of things, God has given us who we are, and that's a great gift to be used at the service of others, which many people working in medical research and the medical professions do every day.
There is actually a randomized clinical study from Harvard about the power of prayer. It was for, I'm sorry, but I'm going to take the sexiness out of the prayer by telling you about this randomized study. It was a group of coronary artery bypass graft patients, and they defined the end point as length of hospital stay after successful bypass surgery. And there was a group which was intensely spiritual and believed in the prayers. And then there was another group, controlled group, where there was no prayer specifically about. They did find that the length of stay was shorter, statistically significant in the prayer group. Now, our job is actually to not go into prostration immediately after finding the results of the study and say, yes, Dr. Lee, we have found the cure for cutting down on the length of stay after bypass surgery. Both the esteemed panelists have talked about equilibrium and balance, and about spirituality when they're talking about it. So much that we don't know gets shoved into spirituality. As you find out that you have neurotransmitters, your balance of your dopamine and what is going on in your hypothalamus. Unfortunately, it already has for a lot of people, but for a lot more, once we know what is really going on, the spiritual diseases like jealousy, anger, greed. Those are the spiritual diseases. That's what I was asking, right? Hey, they are truly imbalance of your neurotransmitters. You can take care of them just like you can take care of your fever and power of prayer. By the way, I'm not an atheist. I do believe in God. Just in my own way. What you're really doing is an exercise with prayer that help balance your imbalance of your neurotransmitters.
Thank you. Great. Go ahead.
Unfortunately, scientists or mathematicians, their job is to simplify things.
I was just gonna, there's a discussion in religion, science, and Christianity right now, and there's a term that John Hott, a professor, uses called the God of the gaps. And the idea is that we like to hide God's agency in the things we don't understand, just like you were saying. So in the medieval period, they thought arrows flew because God held them in flight. And that the principles of the physical universe operate because God keeps those principles, right? And then we discovered things like momentum, and we no longer need God to describe how arrows fly because we have momentum. The challenge that Hott is pointing out is if you are constantly invested in making sure that God's actions are not like actions on material order, the gaps in our knowledge continue to shrink. And so your realm of divine causality is always finding smaller and smaller gaps. And every time a new study comes out from Harvard or somewhere else, it is an affront to your understanding of God's action and decreases the way in which God can be active possibly in the world. And so it sets up for a very antagonistic stance towards science and knowledge and other things. And so, of course, Hott's argument is basically we need to stop doing that. We need to stop trying to hide God's actions and the things we don't understand and take a fuller appraisal of what we must mean by divine action in a world that we are increasingly understanding more. So, anyway, kind of building on what was said here.
Thank you. I know our audience, our community doesn't want us to leave without dealing with some of the elephants in the room. So let's deal with some of the elephants, the elephant that we all have on, or most of us. In America, the issue of masks and mandates have brought to the forefront potential tensions between personal rights and concern for the common good. How should my choices about health and safety be affected by the almost common religious call among people of faith to love your neighbor as yourself? All right, next question. We'll move on. Nobody wants to deal with the elephant in the room. Was it clear or was it not clear?
From a Jewish perspective, the other person is an extension of ourselves. I mean, we look at ourselves as separate individuals, but in a holistic sense, we are all one. So the well-being of the other affects our own well-being. And so if we're well, we increase wellness in the world. So our duty, going back to what I said originally, is to take care of ourselves, and therefore our spirituality, our soul, if you will, soul will also be taken care of. I think we've been saying that all night, actually.
I'm a big believer of personal freedom. And I am a staunch supporter. I just took care of somebody who made it very clear to me, not to me directly, to my nurse actually. I don't know why he chose to do that, but that he's a Jehovah's Witness. We are doing a very high-risk procedure, and he told me under no circumstances circumstances, I will accept blood or blood products. And my response, as most physicians would respond, that we respect that. We respect that, and we understand that it's your body. You're making a decision for yourself. There is a possibility that during the procedure there is perforation, there is bleeding, and you may need blood transfusion. You have expressly told us that you would not accept it, and we respect it. On the other hand, my right to swing my arms around is limited. If I get too close to Jake, and while exercising, swinging of my arms hits him, then in most civilized societies, most, not ours, there is a limit to personal freedom. Always. Once it starts infringing on the rights of others, accepted universally within that society, there are limitations. I have a fast car and I love driving fast. These are some of the best roads that I've ever been to. Who the hell are you to tell me that I have to drive at 40 miles, actually 35 miles an hour on Asbury Road? It is a beautiful empty road. My car can hit 200 miles an hour. Can I do that? Yes, you can. Oh. Why? It's not a matter of my choice.
Yeah, to build up, I've been increasingly, in courses on justice and things like that, the saying that Steve just sort of paraphrased there is, the right to throw my fist ends where your face begins, right? Increasingly, it sounds like public discourse to me is saying, well, but you could have moved your face, right? Like, and that really highlights something that's important in the Catholic moral tradition, is the idea that freedom is, there's a distinction that Catholic ethicists like to draw between freedom of choice versus freedom for the good. And in the Catholic understanding, God has granted us freedom, and so it's very important to protect people's liberty and freedom. But it's not arbitrary freedom. It's not freedom to choose whatever we want to choose. God grants us freedom so that we can choose what is good. And so choosing what is evil, while it's an exercise of freedom of choice, is actually a misuse of our freedom. Right? And so on the one hand, the Catholic tradition really upholds the idea of liberty and freedom and the importance of people being able to make choices. On the other hand, it also has a normative view of how freedom is exercised. And if it's not an exercise of freedom that builds up one's own good, the community's good, the greater good, God's good, then it is the misuse of freedom, right? And so that's why, I think, there's all sorts of different motivations and information sources out there right now that are coloring people's perceptions of things. But at least as far as I understand my faith tradition is concerned, it's not only that I need to limit myself so as not to harm you, but that my freedom also gives me the responsibility to look out for your good as well.
So the care for the stranger in terms of their health, how does that fit in with your family's care, with care of people in your faith? Is there any difference? Or did you just answer that? Okay, all right. Sure. All right, we took care of one, we ate one elephant in the room, let's eat the other one. And I'm asking this really specifically. It says, within your faith tradition, is there debate about getting the COVID vaccine? Which positions, I'm forcing you to actually say vaccine and work with it, okay? Within your faith tradition, is there a debate about getting the COVID vaccine? Which positions do you think are supported by your faith tradition and why? Jake, you're shaking your head yes, so I'll call on you first.
Oh, yeah, well, I've already talked about this one about a dozen times already this year. Yeah, there's big. I mean, the first difference you have to draw is between, especially in an institution, tradition like the Catholic Church, you have sort of the official representation of Catholic belief as taught by the bishops, as what we call the magisterium of the Catholic Church. But then you have the actual on-the-ground Catholics, right? And sometimes there are miles and miles separating the teaching of the Catholic Church officially and the practices of Catholics. So, if you're looking at Catholic teaching regarding the vaccines, it's relatively straightforward. It's a pretty strong endorsement of vaccines and vaccination. The Vatican in Rome has studied the issue. They've come out with statements talking through the moral issues and have concluded that all the current vaccines are morally acceptable. The U.S. Catholic bishops have similarly talked through these issues and likewise concluded the same thing. That is an act of charity towards others in society to get yourself vaccinated. Now, Catholics on the ground do not all accept that opinion. The key issue, at least as Catholics have framed it, is that some of the vaccines that have been developed are developed using stem cell lines, which are generations and generations removed from an initial termination of a pregnancy where those cells came from in the first place. And so because they're derived from the act of abortion, it would seem that they're morally jeopardized. This is where the Catholic tradition has an understanding of direct versus indirect cooperation with evil and principle of double effect and some other moral categories that are essentially tools for sussing out and distinguishing to what extent any given action that you might take, when you know there is some sort of moral compromise going on, to what extent your action is actually supporting, cooperating, furthering that, or is simply tolerating that. And so the judgment of the Vatican and the U.S. bishops has been, and I always get the names mixed up here, and this is my problem here. I believe it's the Pfizer and AstraZeneca, that because no stem cell lines were used in the actual production of the vaccine, but only for testing purposes, the vaccine itself is in no way morally compromised. Catholics do have an obligation to speak out and let biomedical companies know that they would prefer vaccines not be tested on stem cell lines, that stem cell lines cease, embryonic stem cell lines cease being used in medical research. But because the vaccine itself is not actually in any way reliant on those tests, you are not cooperating with that when you receive those vaccines. The other one, which I believe is Moderna, and you can search this on Google to verify, that one actually was developed through the use of stem cell lines at different phases along the way. And so it's a little bit more morally problematic. The interesting parallel, though, is that most of us have MMR vaccines, measles, mumps, and rubella, and the rubella vaccine was developed through the exact same process. And so it is interesting that many Catholics who have MMR vaccination and have given their children MMR vaccination are suddenly really concerned about COVID vaccines that are morally identical. The principle there, in effect, is that because there is a greater good to be served by protection of the health of those around you, your reception of that particular vaccine is not in any way condoning the process by which it was made, but instead is simply tolerating what you would otherwise think is regrettable. And like Catholic understanding, if you went and sought out the Moderna vaccine, if I'm saying that one right, is it Pfizer? Am I backwards? Johnson & Johnson? Okay. I was in an interview and I got in this discussion about this and we went back and forth for 10 minutes and I was like, oh, yep, I've been saying it wrong the whole time, sorry. So I knew this was going to trip me up. Anyway, I even wrote them down on paper and that didn't help because then I just reversed them anyway. Anyway, if in some crazy world a Catholic sought out the most morally compromised because they wanted a vaccine that was developed through stem cells, like, in theory, that would be a moral evil. Like, you're choosing something that is worse for the sake of choosing it because it's worse. That is direct cooperation, right? Whereas, if your primary intention is to protect your health and the health of those around you, and you recognize that there's some moral compromise going on here, but it's not something you in any way had control over, influenced, you're simply tolerating it, that's an indirect and remote cooperation with evil, which within the Catholic understanding is acceptable so long as there are legitimate reasons for it, which is traditionally how the rubella vaccine and now the Johnson & Johnson vaccine are being understood by the Catholic Church. So, but that all said, I know several Catholics who are not getting any vaccines and asking bishops for letters of support of religious opposition. From what I know, bishops quite broadly have been very hesitant and have been advising priests not to give religious exemptions from vaccines. On the other hand, there's a decent case to be made that the Catholic view of the priority of the conscience would allow for individual conscientious objection to vaccines. It just wouldn't be it would not be a religious exemption, but an individual conscientious objection. So I think that's all I have to say on that. Sorry. Time's up. Sorry, guys.
In Jewish tradition, there's no reason no one should not get the vaccine. Period. Along all denominations within our faith. Just merely get the vaccine. And then worry about the rest. We would not put a moral issue with this. Actually, it would be immoral if we didn't. From our tradition. It would be immoral if you're not taking care of your body, which is God's gift to you.
Zeke?
I do that every day. I engage in this conversation on a daily basis. And the guidance that I seek from was the passage that I read from Quran. You engage in a respectful way. Your goal is non-judgmental. Your goal is educational. Most people are not able to understand due to either misinformation or simply lack of education about the vaccine. Its effects on our body and its role, how it makes us immune, relatively immune to this infection. This is a new technology. Even for the doctors, it was new. Even for the bio-savvy doctors who are bench researchers, this was new. So whenever there is something new, there is understandable hesitancy. There are those of us who would just say that, okay, this is from Pfizer. This is from J&J. I'm going to go accept it. U.S. government is saying yes to it. FDA is saying yes to it. I'm going to go get us who would say, well, I've never heard of this before. Well, we had not heard of moon landing also at one time, but I'm not going to be going there. But, you know, when you engage in a conversation, you want to understand other person's point of view. And then you want to respond in a way which is not hurtful, which is not judgmental, which is purely easy to understand, short. Easy to understand and short. My time is short, the person's time is short. We want to get to somewhere. We don't want to talk in circles about vaccines in my office. So I tell them respectfully that this is the technology, this is the efficacy, this is the safety. There are billions and billions of doses administered. India, on Thursday, became the second country in the world where 1 billion jabs have been delivered after China. And we, unfortunately, were doing so well earlier on, and now we're at almost at the bottom of the developed world, or more industrialized world, I should say. I don't know what this word developed. There are reasons for that. And most of the time, in my experience, it is something that if we continue to engage, Roy, we make some progress. There are those who are going to burn in hell. There are those, right? I'll tell you an interesting story. There was a patient that I was asked to see in ICU at Mercy Hospital. Patient was COVID pneumonia. He was on BiPAP. It's a mask through and the oxygen is delivered through the mask. So you can still talk. So by the time I was asked to see him, he was already intubated. So good thing I didn't need to talk to him. Because the nurse told me that till the day he got so bad that he required mechanical ventilation, that he had to have a tube placed in his throat, into the lungs, so that the ventilator would breathe for him, as long as he could talk. He continued to say that this is nothing, this is a hoax, this is wrong, he doesn't have it. So there are those. So please, we focus on where there is, we feel that there is some benefit. We focus on everybody in general, but on those where we see some room, some interest in understanding of this process.
Would Muslims in general agree with you, or is there disagreement among Muslims in terms of...
You're asking me to talk about Muslims?
In general, if you can help from your perspective of your faith tradition.
I really don't know. I've never heard so far in any of the... He's the expert on Muslims. No, I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think there is any concerns or problems related to faith-based understanding against vaccine.
Because Jake has talked about his tradition. There are clearly medical procedures that he would reject morally from his faith tradition, and I would give you gentlemen a chance to respond. Are there medical procedures that your faith tradition would reject either morally or ethically, based on your faith tradition? You'll have to talk about the science, yes or no, but I'm just curious from...
Actually, I can tell you that there was a question about transplants for a long time, but I think it has been settled. I think that most religious scholars that at least I ever get a chance to read or listen to have unanimously supported, again, preservation and promotion of health. The overwhelming principle is what Rabbi is saying, that health is a gift, it's a trust that is given according to the Muslim tradition, according to all traditions, I think. I shouldn't say Muslim tradition. And we are the guardians of it. And God has given us the gift of intellect. And He has asked us and invited us and welcomed us and encouraged us to use it. He says that spread on the face of the earth and find my signs and apply them to promote your life on this earth. And reconcile. And be the ones who do what we call as acts of reconciliation, acts of promotion and preservation. So if that involves putting a stent, yes, or if that involves getting a vaccine, yes, if that involves getting a transplant, yes.
Jim, anything you would add from your faith tradition?
You know, we have a tradition of Jewish doctors, and it comes from our Torah-based tradition that health is something that needs to be developed. It isn't just given. Health is work. Health is part of our responsibility. So I don't think anything to say would be off limits unless it's harming the patient in any way. But that's a hard issue, I suppose, for doctors. What's harming and what isn't. But overall, you look out for the betterment of the patient. And so Judaism would definitely agree with that. And the myth is that, we have a lot of Jewish doctors because the tradition teaches us that we are not to let the status quo always be our guide. We are to challenge the status quo. We are to make things better. We are not here to just accept everything as it is. We are here to repair the world. Our job is to repair. And if we understand that, then medicine is certainly part of that repair of the world.
Our time is almost gone, and there's one other thing I want to address with our panel members, but there might be a couple of minutes for you to ask a question from the audience. So while you're thinking of a question, something else you would like to pose to our panel members, I'll ask them to close at least with my question that you sort of led to, and that is when medical help doesn't help. When you have chronic disease, pain, when cancer comes and there is no medical answer, what does your faith tradition provide in dealing with the fears or the expectation of the end as a result of a medical problem? I would like each one of you to address that, please.
I'm an eternal optimist, and I believe in Google's project that we are going to beat death. I believe that using God's gift of our intellect, there is every effort that we are doing and we will continue to do to overcome and find answers. What is the function of appendix? So, those of you who were paying attention, he said that. So, there were many things that we just didn't not know 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, and we know now. Hats off to those of my patients who have volunteered to be in the randomized clinical trials, who have enhanced our ability to use medications that they did not know would work on them or would harm them. And we did not know would work on them or harm them. You know, when you understand that, that is what strengthens my belief in God. This kind of behavior. Not that cell line is coming from thousands of probably millions of cells gap between that vaccine that is being inoculated in me and that original aborted fetus. It is about, think of that. When my niece at age 23 is diagnosed with triple-negative cancer, breast cancer, with a 9-month-old baby. And she says that, and we don't know the answer to that question. We don't know what works best. Nothing works in that situation. When we say triple negative, we know that the markers are negative, all the chemo is not going to work, all the hormone therapy is not going to work, all the immune therapy is not going to work. But you know what? That's where those people say that, yes, I want to be in that clinical trial. I have hope. And their hope enables and promotes our scientific understanding of what is not known today. So Roy, what we don't know today, we pray to God that He enables us our better understanding. That's what Abraham said. God, give me wisdom. Give me wisdom and make my tongue speak truth with sincerity for the generations to come.
Yeah, I would say from the Catholic perspective, the major limitations on specific medical procedures that the Catholic bioethics tends to take issue with are those that in some way are seen as directly contradicting the value of human life in some way. And so they tend to be beginning of life and end of death and end of life issues. So that does color the Catholic understanding of biomedical ethics. On the other hand, the Catholic tradition also asserts that while life is a great good, it is not the ultimate good. But that, in fact, sacrificing one's life may be an ultimate expression of the dignity of the human person. And so in the Catholic tradition, while the dignity and value of human life is held up in such regard that sometimes it does sit at odds with other opinions, Catholicism itself also has this way of affirming that that is not the ultimate good, and that one's ultimate meaning and purpose in life rests in God's will and God's plan and the relationship with your Creator. And so I'm not at all well disposed to be a chaplain or something like that, but I would say that's where that kind of work takes its start.
And Jim, you have done the chaplain work, so share with us.
Yeah, I've been involved in all types of work. It's a difficult question. You're talking about end-of-life issues as well as...
Just dealing with the fears and when medical science can't help. And we're eventually going to get help. Praise the Lord for you working for that. When there doesn't seem to be any help right now for that individual patient.
Community rallies, for us, if we rally to the patient or to those who are sick, it is our responsibility to see to their needs, of course. which is a spiritual act in itself, as we're saying here as well. We have what we call a minion, 10 men or women that come together to say prayers over the person or with the person. The main idea in our faith is accompaniment. We are not leaving the individual alone. We are not alone. That's first off. We are not alone. And so we accompany the person on the journey wherever they happen to be. We're with them. We share in our prayers and our hopes for the person. But we have the obligation to visit. We have the obligation to work for the patient, to help as much as we can. We're to do everything within our power that we can to see to the betterment of that patient. There's an old Jewish expression that if 60 people visit someone sick, they get better. So the next time, make sure a lot of people come see you in the hospital. So it's not true, but maybe we take a little bit of the pain away. Maybe we do that through our presence. Maybe there's more going on than we see. Something that transcends our lives.
We have a couple more minutes. Is there anyone in the audience? Yes.
I guess teasing the previous question about rejecting medical aid on moral grounds. So an example I was thinking of was like suppose in some weird corrupt society, the rich who needed medical attention could get transplants from organs stolen from the poor. Like the poor will get killed for their organs and give that can be given to the rich. In like a situation like that where there's clearly something morally wrong in the medical attention, is it morally wrong for the person receiving aid to accept the medical treatment, or is it just or is the only moral responsibility on the physician's side?
Our experiments are like bread and butter of ethics, so this is funny. According to the Catholic understanding, it would all have to do with if your participation in that system was cooperating with that evil or merely tolerating it. So if in some way if in some way your reception of such things actually promoted or encouraged it, then no, you wouldn't be able to do it. If there was simply the way the system was and there was nothing you could do about it or affect it, that would be a different scenario. So it just all has to do with whether you are cooperating versus tolerating, and whether there's a proportionate reason for it.
Any other response to the problem of inequity among medical care and how a faith tradition might respond? Or even you could give some history of how your faith tradition has responded to pandemics and other things. There's been history when, there's been inequality among medical care, and some faith traditions have stepped up and provided that. Any other response to the injustice or inequality among medical care?
are not global. If you think that you can vaccinate in Israel or in Pakistan or in the United States your population 4 times over, and in sub-Saharan Africa or in some Pacific island nation, the vaccination rate is going to be next to 0, this virus is going to mutate. And you will have a new mutant that you will continue to chase your tails. So I'm the one who actually gives the vaccine. I'm not the one who is on the policy level. But it doesn't take an Einstein to understand that, look, the inequity in healthcare delivery has been exemplified most recently through this pandemic. Where earlier on, I mean, the so-called developed countries have ordered the vaccine doses which were 4 or 5 times their population. So, morality? I don't think we're very moral people. No. We want we were engaged in a conversation, oh, vaccine, getting vaccine, not getting vaccine. Why? Because we know that it is getting expired on our shelves. If we know that there is no vaccine to be had, I wonder if we would have that kind of conversation. We would just get in line and get it.
Thank you. Jim, would you like to comment on that one? Or? Okay.
I think that our perspective would be do what you can where you are at the time. That's all. I mean, we have all these charitable organizations working in the world. That's a good response. That's one response. Maybe we need to come up with new responses. Would be my hope. That there's something new to say and do in the world. It is up to us to find those new responses.
And I always appreciate when the children of Abraham can end with a challenge of what we do from here, where we go. The conversations are important and significant, and I have appreciated our conversation tonight. It's been very enlightening, but these things do affect real people, and our topic today obviously has. We usually will enjoy smaller group conversations, and next month when we meet at Loris College, interfaith will be the topic. We will be following and getting input from our medical experts, but if we can, we like to break up into smaller groups and have smaller conversations, so we hope to restore that as well. The Quran study happens on Tuesdays at 5:20 if you're interested in that with Dr. Casas. It's online right now. You can see John Eby for that. And as we mentioned about caring for others, your invite email had an opportunity to assist in Afghanistan refugees in the Midwest, upper Midwest, to again put sort of feet on our conversations of caring for our neighbors. So again, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Please continue the conversation, thinking about these important topics, knowing how to interact with each other in our community. If you'll join me in thanking our panelists that have helped us in our discussion. It's been great again to see each other's faces. I realize the greetings have been a little bit awkward. You're not sure if you're shaking hands or hugging. We'll figure it out, okay? It's just good to see everybody. So again, thank you for joining us. Have a good evening. We'll see you in a month.